It's time to break out your pens and your notepads and write down the 5 different points here that make up a covenant, or the 5 criterion. The first thing that every covenant has is an oath. And you're asking yourself, an oath? I thought Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 not to swear. Well, we're not getting into that, but I will just preface that by saying Jesus was talking about swearing in a certain way. And to summarize that, I believe he was saying, don't swear trivially. And covenants are anything but trivial oaths. When God makes a covenant, he states, I swear that I'm going to do this, whatever the agreement is. And then man swears, I'm going to do this as well. And both parties, God and man, are agreeing to the same thing. That brings us to the next part of a covenant, number 2, and that is sacrifice. There's some type of sacrifice that is made in the Bible whenever man enters into covenant with God, or maybe we should say that God enters into covenant with man. He seems to be the one that initiates these throughout the Bible. A sacrifice in Jeremiah chapter 34 is called to cut a covenant. And so, obviously with the word sacrifice, we're talking about an animal is brought to the forefront here in this agreement, and they would take a knife and they would cut the covenant, meaning they would cut this animal in half, and they would spread it in half. And then, according to what we can see, the best from history in the Bible is that both parties would walk in between the halves of the covenant, and that had some significance. That brings us, before, these are interconnected thoughts, but the third thing, the third criterion of a covenant involves blood. Blood was obviously shed, so you have this sacrifice that was split in half, they're walking in between, and blood is spilt everywhere. Now in the Bible, blood represents the life source. It's kind of the life energy of humans, of animals, of everything that lives and breathes. And so when blood is spilt, that signifies that life is on the line. When they walk between these two halves of the animal that have been sacrificed, and there's blood everywhere, it signifies the penalty if either party, whether that's man or God and man, either party reneges on their agreement. So, may what happened to that bloody dead animal, may that happen to me if I don't prove good on my part of the agreement. In Genesis chapter 15, we see that visualized a little bit, if you can in your mind, when Abraham enters into covenant with God. He splits several animals in half, and then toward the end of the day, he sees energy. He sees the glory of God in a cloud of energy go between these animals, and God was swearing that he would uphold his covenant to make Abraham a great nation, and all the other parts of that agreement involved. So far we have an oath being stated, we have a sacrifice being made, the sacrifice cut in half, we have blood being spilt, and the fourth thing is that always there is a token of some kind to represent that an agreement was made. Not only that, it would help both parties to remember that the agreement was still in effect. For example, every time that you see a rainbow, it doesn't actually, by nature of its origin, represent the LGBTQ community. It does represent the covenant that God made with all mankind. And this one was not optional. It wasn't like it was conditional on man's part. Every other covenant that God's entered into with man has had conditions to it, but this one was unconditional. And God was saying, whenever you see that rainbow, that's a token, or that's a sign that I will never destroy the earth again by floodwaters. Now, later in the Bible, he will destroy the earth again, but this token, this rainbow, reminds us every time after it rains that God is holding to his part of the agreement, and he never has destroyed the earth again. So that's the fourth thing of every covenant, a token. With Abraham and his covenant with God, it was circumcision. That was the token of the covenant. We'll get into what was the token of the old covenant as we see it in Scripture, and the new covenant as we are introduced to that in the New Testament. Finally, the fifth thing that you will see usually, and if it's not seen explicitly, it is usually there implied, is that of a meal. And so as God enters into covenant with man, there is always some type of a meal to kind of inaugurate and commemorate this event. And that meal represents fellowship. It represents that these two parties are now in agreement, they're in fellowship, they are on good terms. And so a lot of times you'll see in the Bible two men having a meal together. That means that those two people are in good terms. And if you're going to enter into this sober of a contract with somebody, then this is signifying to everybody present and watching, a covenant has been made. And so when you see those five things, an oath, a sacrifice, blood, a token, and a meal, that gives me all the criteria that I'm looking for in the scripture between God and man and covenant.